I would like to begin our webinar series for this evening. On behalf of TISS and Azim Premji School of Education at the TISS Hyderabad, I'd like to welcome all of you for our conversations today. Today, our conversation is with Dr. Leya Mathew, who is an assistant professor in the Social Sciences Division at the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. Dr. Mathew has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and her research examines the socio-cultural transitions that have accompanied economic liberalization in India. Her previous research examined non-elite private English schooling as a socio-political expression of aspiration in a new consumer-driven society. Her current project traces youth aspirations in the context of precarized work conditions. Dr. Mathew was previously part of the research group at NIAS Bangalore, where she explored the emergence of middle-class feminism. She's also a founder member of Pen Camera at the University of Pennsylvania, an interdisciplinary collective of researchers and educators committed to multimodality in knowledge production. At Ahmedabad University, Dr. Mathew pursues research and teaching in anthropology, sociology, gender, and intersectional inequality, with a specific focus on the Indian experience in the post-market reform period. Today, she will be talking about her book with us, English Linguistic Imperialism from Above. I am sure that I wouldn't be wrong in saying that we're all looking forward to Dr. Matthews talking to us about her book. I would also like to invite all of the participants who have joined us this evening. Before I hand over to Dr. Mathew, I would just like to go over the broad program schedule and sort of the rules for this evening. I'd like to request everyone to please keep themselves on mute as you join and participate through the series. Dr. Mathew is scheduled to speak for roughly 40 to 45 minutes, after which we will be opening the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Please feel free to share and write your questions in the chat, which we can take up at the end, towards the end of the discussion, or you can type it in the chat at the point when you want to ask the question as well. With that, I would like to hand over to Dr. Mathew and request her to commence the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I will start sharing screen. Right, so the book is titled English Linguistic Imperialism from Below. And I thought that I will structure the talk in a way that approaches research and the publishing of a book as a process. We tend to think of research publication, particularly books, as finished products. So I thought, particularly to a student audience, but also for us as researchers, that it'd be interesting to consider it also as a process. So in the doing of research and the publishing of the book, who was I accountable to, right? And what were the stakes and expectations of that community? Since this was a PhD thesis, there's of course the dissertation committee. They were anthropologists. In India, they would be sociologists. The interlocutors, I was accountable to the mothers I was working with. And then the publisher, they also have their own sort of perspectives, expectations, demands. And as you can see, so there are overlapping but separate disciplines. And the questions from each of those perspectives would look slightly different. So for my dissertation committee, what was important was the context of liberalization, gender, class. What are aspirations doing in this historic context? For the mothers, It was moving out of intergenerational poverty, achieving dignity. For education researchers or practitioners, and I'm grateful to Rekha for pointing it out in the last discussion that we had, it was a very urgent question of how do we address enduring systemic failures. The publisher is also an applied linguistics list. And the question of language domination, particularly in the context of neoliberalism, is something that has been animating debates in that field. So the strength and weakness of the book is that it addresses all the perspectives. So it's a somewhat of a difficult book to read if you don't want to do that. For better or worse, all of these were for me very important questions, and the story would be incomplete without them. Now, the phenomenon explained in the book has been researched before, obviously, and under the banner of low-fee private schooling, or typically it's also called low-cost or budget schools. I explain why I prefer non-elite rather than low-fee private schooling, because the mothers did not find these fees low at all. I mean, they struggled to pay the fees. So since I was foregrounding their perspective, I preferred the term non-elite. But when I'm comparing between different school types in the panchayat, in the town, I do use the term low fee. So this phenomenon is primarily from grades 1 to 4. And it's often, but not always, synonymous with English medium schooling. And this has been documented in several parts of Africa, South Asia. And for India, Geeta Kingdon reports that for her 2000 paper, notes that 49% of primary school children in urban areas and 21% of their rural counterparts attended fee-charging private schools. And existing literature in the Indian context has largely looked at this by comparing the efficiency of public and private schools. So they've compared inputs like building, infrastructure, facilities like toilets, drinking water, teacher presence, and teaching activity. The most famous is, of course, Thule's papers. And in these framings, and in these papers, private schools were found to be relatively better than government schools. But critical scholars, including Padma Sarangapani, argue that the research and advocacy for low-fee private schooling celebrates minimalist provision as efficient pedagogy. And it has become a very polarized debate about whether the state or the market is the more efficient provider of primary education. That's sort of where the debate has come to. The focus in these debates has been on provision and the life worlds and aspirations of the consumers. Here, non-elite mothers are not usually addressed. Neither has there been a serious engagement with English language pedagogy, even though all of the articles also talk about English as one of the prime attractions of fee-charging private schools. But non-elite mothers are not just rational consumers choosing the more efficient commodity. They're also ethical moral actors situated in histories of inequality who have recently migrated to a new consumer society. Now, if you look at the region, so this is the princely state of Thiruvidampur. The fieldwork region is the Madhya Thiruvidampur region, what is now the state of Kerala, the southern part of it. When we look at specific cases, like for instance, the Kerala case, it's easier to see that comparing infrastructure and teacher presence is somewhat inadequate. For instance, Kerala has been held up as an exceptional model of development, especially in relation to education. And in the contemporary, the same robust state-funded schooling system, which is celebrated in development narratives, is in crisis with the rise of uneconomic state-funded schools, which is attributed to privatization. So how do we account for all these histories and contradictions? You can't do that by comparing inputs and outputs. Now, to go more specifically to the fieldwork region, so the primary schooling sites in the gray row under 2013-14, what you will see there are two school sites. St. Thomas is a state-funded, aided school. It was Malayalam medium. It was uneconomic. Across 4 grades, there were only 12 students. The New English School is the low-fee private school, if you will. It's a CBSE school. Now, that's another thing, right? I mean, when we talk about CBSE, there is the DPS, which is charging 2 lakhs, and there'll also be other kinds of CBSE schools. So private schools are heavily stratified as well. So how do you disaggregate and understand, the larger ecosystem of private schooling? So this is how they are in 2013-14. But if you look at the histories, St. Thomas was established in 1894. That's a fairly longish history. And it was established for slave castes very clearly. And in 2014, it had over the years become completely Dalit. So there's a continuity of history that we see. And if you look at these older histories, so in 1894, St. Thomas is started as part of the church reformation that's happening around that period in the region. And there are separate schools, primary schools in those times for Malayalam medium, to which the upper caste went. So segregations have existed for a long time. This is not new at all. The first English school in the village, we're not even talking about a town or an area, in the same village, was started in 1910. This was a middle school. It's called St. John's. So private schooling has also existed for a long time. And with the formation of Kerala, with the linguistic state that is formed in 1956, and then the Kerala education rules, which is what the development narrative talks about, all private schools were taken over by the state, and they were turned into Malayalam medium schools. But this lasts for a very short period, because by 1964, St. John's was by then made into a Malayalam medium school. It became a state-funded school. But in 1964, they start an English medium section. So it's not a private school, it's a state-funded school with an English medium section, which has separate fees. And so these are new forms of inequality that are very creatively reproduced. And also remember that this is the time that the central government starts Kendriya Vidyalayas. So folks in Kerala are wondering why those in central schools can study in English medium, and those in Kerala cannot send their children to English medium schools. Why do they have to compulsorily send their children to Malayalam medium schools? So at this time in Kerala, what actually happens is ICSE schools are being established during this period. This happens in the town, not in the village, but there are families from the village who send their children to ICSE schools in the nearby town. And it is post-liberalization really that CBSE starts becoming popular. This is also the time when CBSE and entrance exams for medicine and engineering start getting interlinked very explicitly. And in the period between 1990 and 2005, there are 13 private CBSE schools which are established. And there is this long history through which the New English School, it starts off as a feeder school to the English medium section in the state-funded high school. Slowly it becomes a separate school, which is unrecognized. Then it takes affiliation with the CBSE, begins as an elite school, and over time, it has become a non-elite school. So keeping these histories in mind is very important, because these are the histories that were animating the aspirations. So parents never talked about comparing buildings. They did not talk about, the kinds of language that was being used. I saw used in development economist literature. That was not the language in which parents were talking about English medium schooling. They were talking about these histories. That's what they were referencing. Now, if you look at the aggregated perspective of aspiration at the panchayat level, So I initially collected data from the DEO, the District Education Officer, checked it with the AEO who looks at primary schools. DEO primarily looks at high schools. So the primary schools go under the AEO. And then I also visited all the schools to cross-check the numbers. Now the economic section was very interesting. But I'll just briefly take you to the numbers first. The largest percentage of students were enrolled into relatively low fee charging private English medium schools. These charged tuition fees at that time around 8,000 annually. The medium fee school charged around 15,000. Now, according to state policy, so this is also a time when Kerala is very conscious of uneconomic schooling, and they have clamped down on unrecognized schools. And according to state policy, an English medium section can be opened in a state-funded primary school only if it is sufficient enrollment in at least 2 Malayalam medium sections. But a 2012 government order clarified that an English medium section can be retained if student enrollment has gone down and only one Malayalam medium section is operational. So the two schools, the two state schools that were listed as economic, had opened English medium sections in
I think Dr. Mathew might be experiencing some internet difficulties. We'll just give it a few more uh, minutes.
sorry, I think I lost you for a bit.
Yes.
Shares. Right. So I will now move on to the, an overview of the methods. This was based on a 19-month ethnography. As already mentioned, it was anchored at two schools. There was St. Thomas, the state-funded Malayalam medium school, and the New English School. So I interacted with families, with students. I was also roped into teaching, which is how then it becomes also a lot more invested in analyzing language pedagogy. Interviews were conducted with the families. So these were primarily mothers, some fathers, a few grandmothers as well. And in terms of English language pedagogy and policy, there were parallel tracks because the systems are different. One is private, non-elite private, and the other is the government system. And just tracing the system itself was very interesting. So the Kerala state-funded schools have a very elaborate infrastructure of support and governance. It includes the Block Resource Center, the District Institute, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, the District Education Officer, the Kerala SCRT, the State Institute of English. There are several agencies. I also participated in, since I was teaching, I participated in teacher training. I looked at textbooks, training materials, policy documents. Now, the New English School was different in the sense that they prescribe the NCRT textbooks. A lot of private schools subscribe to privately published textbooks, but the New English School actually used NCRT textbooks, which is how I was directed to the NCRT. I also looked at privately published textbooks. I'll come to that later. And to understand the larger sort of ecosystem of private schools, I also looked at high fee schools, did some classroom observations in medium fee schools, and marketing materials, salespeople, what are the incentives if you prescribe, say, to Oxford University Press's New Broadway, then we will give you a smart classroom free. So there's a lot of marketing material also that was doing the rounds in the school. So this is sort of the larger, um, what the process looked like. Before I move to the data, I want to very briefly go over the theoretical frameworks. So anthropologists theorize consumption as a social practice through which notions of the self and one's place in society are negotiated. So consumption is not just buying or possessing things or lacking them. Rather, we use commodities to construe value for the self and to participate in different kinds of social relations. And it's important to remember that liberalization profoundly altered the consumption arena from one characterized by absence and subsistence living to one of plenitude and stratification. It's not just private schools that we're talking about. Everything from clothes to food to kitchen appliances became accessible in a dizzying variety. Now, this required citizens to revalue things, the self, and the social relations they were embedded in. For example, Ritti Lucas describes how young lower caste men in Kerala, they were able to rework valuable social locations for themselves through jeans and shirt. So imagine, so Ritti was doing her fieldwork in the 1990s, and from a caste specific clothing to be able to shift to jeans and shirt, what are the kinds of affordances that brings out? Arjun Appadurai calls this affective imaginative work of self-transformation and the rearrangement of terms of recognition, the capacity to aspire. Now, Appadurai proposes a very generalized theory of aspiration, but I argue that we can think of a more specific theory of aspiration for the context of liberalization. And here I found the literature from post-socialist transition scholars very helpful. Daphne Berdal in particular uses the term temporal migrations. She's looking at East Germans after the unification of Germany. And she writes that East Germans had emigrated without leaving home when the Berlin Wall fell. It's as if you went to Canada without going to Canada. You're still in the village. That is how much the material social world in the village had changed. You stay in place, but you've moved to a different world. And the transformations and self-makings entailed in consumer practices were not just individual claims to self-recognition, but also a central mechanism of capitalist accumulation. These are also businesses, but there are also very political aspirations attached to them. So how do we hold them together? For me, the idea of affective labor was very useful here. So labor in its earlier Marxist conceptualization was understood as producing material things for profitable exchange, typically in factories to propel industrial capitalism. Affective labor alerts us to consumer labor that is expended in the production of desirable social identities and in turn drives capital accumulation. For instance, if you think of Instagram or Facebook, we are doing all the work, but there's also a lot of money that is made out of it, right? We don't get that money. So the affective labor is a lot of how capital accumulation happens in the contemporary consumer society. As William Mazzarella explains, capitalist consumer societies generate value out of enjoyment, play, vulnerability, and of course, aspiration. And as several scholars have pointed out, the affective labors of consumption are especially pertinent for those on the margins. One example is Catherine Ziskowski. She's looking at basic computer training centers, which teach young Muslim women in Hyderabad. And she writes about how the Muslim women learn to aspire for fantasy IT futures in a job market that's very hostile to Muslim female bodies. It's the very impossibility of the dream that spurs frantic affective labors, she explains. And Ritti Lucas has this line in her book where she writes that those on the margins of capitalist articulations are yet fully formed by its structures of aspiration and opportunity. So these are the theoretical orientations from which I approach non-elite mothering and private schooling. Now moving on to the data sections. So these are just reference pictures that I downloaded from Google. It's not from the fieldwork site, but just to give you some sense, a visual representation. 62-year-old Annamma vividly remembered an earlier time when there was nothing and when life was difficult. She's one of the grandmothers who I engaged with in the research. So she said that there was nothing hereabouts. She was talking about life only a decade ago, without piped water, without motorable roads, or a sturdy house that could weather the monsoons. She described her earlier everyday life as an odyssey of work. In those days, I didn't even get to sit. Annu kutte irunnattilla, she said of a lifetime spent drawing water from the well, cooking with firewood, scrubbing soot blackened vessels with coconut fiber and ash, bringing up children, taking care of aging in-laws. Unlike Annamma, who had cooked with firewood, 38-year-old Abia remembered her mother cooking with dried leaves. They didn't have firewood to cook with. For all the grandmothers and mothers I interviewed and interacted with, the restructuring of gendered material words through piped water and cooking gas had configured migrations into a now of sukha savaryangal or comfort and ease. This temporal migration from a past dominated by physical labor and material deprivation obliged aspirational work. If mothers in earlier decades barely had time to sit down, now mothers had to sit with children when they studied. Average monthly income amongst the interviewed families had increased around 900% to approximately rupees 20,000. Middle class villagers during the same period earned much more, between 50,000 and a lakh. It's important to note that the policies of economic liberalization came into place in early 1990s. The most radical economic changes villagers narrated are for the post 2000 years. So there's also an arc of liberalization. 8 fathers who worked as drivers, construction workers, electricians, and plumbers in the Persian Gulf earned between rupees 20,000 and 25,000, while others doing similar work in Kerala reported an income of around rupees 10,000. One mother, Annamma's daughter, worked as a nurse in Saudi Arabia. She earned rupees 80,000. As for other working mothers, all except two did home-based work like tailoring or worked as teachers. The ascendance of a cash economy had increased the economic value of work. 9 families had repaired or built new houses, a previously inconceivable expense. 4 of these were not immigrants like Abia, who had a new house just finished, not yet painted. When I visited her at home for the interview, Abia offered me cold water from her fridge and remarked, "Things are much better now." While the house indexed durable change for the entire household, the gendered fabric of public life had also transformed. 8 women drove two-wheelers. 2 mothers were learning how to drive. All mothers wore salwar kameez to go out. The massification of consumer culture thus afforded non-elites a much more expansive tapestry of gendered resources with which to craft new social selves. The salwar kameez instead of caste-specific apparel, cooking gas instead of firewood, packaged food alongside traditional food, allowed a wider range of women to perform aspects of middle-class respectable femininity. Now, this training in gendered middle-class self-making automatically spills over into educational desire because respectable womanhood in India is defined around domestic responsibility and childbearing. So while educational aspiration is not peculiar to the contemporary moment, people have always been aspirational. It's not that people were not aspirational during colonial times or during the early years of independence. What is different is how aspiration articulates with consumer citizenship and consumer practices. Now, how did critical pedagogues, teachers, textbook writers, and policy documents respond to non-elite English medium schooling and their aspirations? Unfortunately, these unanimously shamed non-elite parental aspirations. One key technique in aspiration shaming was the separation of the pedagogic from its economic basis. And as you may have figured out already from the earlier slide on the histories of the schools, this separation is very recent. Dominant caste residents could access fee-paying English medium schooling from 1910 onwards without being morally suspect. In fact, only those who had exceptional economic resources could access English medium schooling. Economic resources gave one moral value till the 1990s, but now they're seen as being too greedy or being too aspirational. These are the languages in which parental aspirations are shamed. There's a lot more, especially in terms of our policy documents and English language policy in particular, shames parental aspirations. That's described in detail in the book. In the interest of time, I'll move on to mothers at the Malayalam medium school. At the new English school in much of Edanadu, non-elite families had migrated into new worlds without leaving home. St. Thomas School introduced me to a small collective who lived outside of this migration experience. That all were Dalit pointed to the profound significance of caste in the village. Given the magnitude of deprivation and segregation, I expected anger and despair. Instead, I found obsessive hope. The only way to survive this caste-specific experience of abjection was to hope that children would migrate out of poverty. 30-year-old Jessie lived in a Dalit colony about a kilometer from St. Thomas. Her colony was a strip of land wedged between paddy marshes and a pond that had over the years become a dumping ground. After every downpour, Jessie's colony turned into a mud pool. She once said, I've thought about ending my life many times. I'm fatigued, teacher. What a hellish life I live. Endo naragicha jeevithama. Why should I suffer like this? But when I think of my two children, who will they have if I am not there? Will anybody else take care of them? You tell me. Jessie told me this while watching a pot of water slowly fill up at the roadside river water tap. For Jessie, this tap was her lifeline from where she collected water in pots and buckets for the needs of a family of four. Her colony, like most Dalit colonies in the village, did not yet have piped water. So you can see the differences between the two schools in terms of the worlds that the material worlds that mothers lived in. This was still the past that the mothers at the new English school had moved out of. The one exception at St. Thomas School was Sindhu's family, dressed impeccably in cotton silk salwar kameez from the upscale Rusan store. Sindhu stood out as someone who did not belong at an uneconomic school. She had a bachelor's degree and often took up part-time consulting projects with the Panchayat office. Her husband worked as a chef in the Middle East. Other fathers attached to St. Thomas were daily wage laborers. Sindhu's family's migration experience was immediately visible since theirs was the only family with a branched new house built on a recently purchased plot of land. Sindhu had sent her oldest son, Abhinesh, first to a private English medium school, but teachers complained that he was not up to the mark. On their advice, the boy had stayed in UKG for 2 years, but teachers were still dissatisfied with his progress. Sindhu began to wonder if something was wrong with her son, and she transferred Abhinesh to St. Thomas in class 1. At St. Thomas, Abhinesh blossomed. He was in class 3 when I started my fieldwork, and he was the undisputed star of St. Thomas, winning district level prizes for elocution, classical singing, and light music. Like Abhinesh's transfer from the non-colony space of the English medium school to the colony-like space of St. Thomas, Sindhu's transition out of a Dalit colony followed a similar meandering back. Sindhu's family had till recently lived in a Dalit colony. Her husband's 15 years of emigrant work had eventually amassed enough economic resources for them to buy land outside the colony. Sindhu's new house was ready, gleaming white with all modern conveniences. But by the time the house was ready, the dominant caste who lived in that vicinity had sold out their properties to Dalits like Sindhu and moved elsewhere. The neighborhood had become a segregated Dalit middle-class neighborhood. Though mothers at St. Thomas articulated a terrible discontent and fatigue with living in the normative past of the village, they rarely spoke about desires for good futures, but they obsessed over academic performance, a socially sanctioned and appropriate orientation to good futures. One morning when I reached St. Thomas, I saw Jessie's daughter at the door, hugging her mother and weeping. First graders and preschoolers routinely sob and wail as mothers leave them, but Jessie was in third grade then, and I'd never seen her cry. The other mothers were sitting in their usual spot chatting, and they told me that Jessie's daughter had come to school without doing her homework, and Jessie had slapped her full across the face. When her daughter burst out crying, Jessie immediately hugged her, consoled her, and dried her tears. But she immediately burst out crying. The only way any desirable future could even be imagined was if her child did well in school, which JC usually did. When social norms purport schooling and academic success as the only way out of material destitution, hoping became obsessive and punishing. Mothers at St. Thomas solicited the help of more literate cousins or neighbors to monitor their children's schoolwork. Any slip up was met with harsh punishment. Mothers were fiercely optimistic about the academic success and possible futures of their children, but despair too emerged in brief flashes when mothers were forced to face the inadequacy of Malayalam medium schooling for desirable higher education, secure employment, and respectable futures. The following sections move to policy analysis. How did the education system meet mothers' aspirations for English learning? So what I analyze in the book are three sets of reforms. So the St. Thomas came under the Kerala system. So that was the Kerala SCRT systems, which began with DPEP in 1993 and then went on with the NCF in 2005 and continues on whenever there are changes. The New English School was affiliated to the CBSE, and though primary grades are not technically affiliated to a secondary school board, the larger sort of expectations sort of percolated down. So the CBSE reforms begin in 1988. This is directed largely out of through the British Council. CEPL was involved. Professor Leya Mathew did the implementation study. There was a second phase in 2010 when CBSE picked it up again, and this was done primarily with in consultation with Trinity College London. The NCRT reforms, the ones that I'm referring to, are the ones that came out of the National Curriculum Framework 2005. The English part of it was led by theoretical linguists. The blueprint was prepared by Professor Amritavalli, who was a professor at CEPL. Without going into too much of detail, I want to draw your attention to the diversity of agents involved. So as I mentioned, the NCRT reforms were headed by theoretical linguists. They were working under the leadership of Professor Krishna Kumar. The CBSE worked very closely with the British Council and British universities. The Kerala reforms were headed by a Chomskyan linguist, Dr. K.N. Anandan, and supported by the KSSP, which is the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, which is a cultural educational organization which is very close links with the CPM. Now, this expertise intersects with a variety of regional and local institutions and actors, as I already mentioned, at the district, block, and village level. You know, the BRC, the SSA, all of these come into this process. Given this large diversity, obviously there are a lot of differences in how the reforms unfold. But what surprised me the most was ultimately the reforms, they all sort of came together in a very sort of precise way, in that they shifted second language learning norms in the country from literacy learning to conversational skills. Again, histories are important to understand the significance of this shift. The teaching of English in India had earlier focused on literacy proficiency. Fraser Gupta characterized India as a scholastic country as far as learning English was concerned, and regional languages, not English, dominated social life. For the most part, English pedagogy did not consider socializing in English or conversational skills a realistic or desirable pedagogic objective in India. And this pedagogic history, which is documented by a lot by Professor Tikku, again associated with CEPL, was completely erased by the reforms. So the new English school had mothers and teachers who could read and write English, but not speak it. But policy resulted in reform textbooks that could only be taught by English speakers. So locally available resources and practices were thus delegitimized, and literacy learning was glossed as rote and explained as unethical pedagogy. So I'll just give you some, glimpses of what the reform materials look like. So this is a lesson from a second standard NCRT textbook, the Marigold. And you can see there's a lot of text, and teachers thought the textbook was not teachable. And students at the end of the teaching could not read through this text independently, because that was not the objective of the textbook. The textbook imagined an English speaking teacher talking with students, and there wasn't any literacy pedagogy that was embedded into the textbook. This was completely based on an oracy pedagogy. The Kerala textbooks were much harsher because the textbook itself was a compilation of fragments. There wasn't even a coherent textbook that was available to students. What I've shown you is from the source book, which is available only with the teachers. There are a lot of interactions and narratives which teachers are expected to read out. So this is a scripted curriculum, again, expecting oracy as the primary sort of methodology of teaching in the classroom. But as you can see on the right-hand side, in what the students have written, the exams are all written exams. So the pedagogy is based on oracy, but what is evaluated is written proficiency. And I describe the violence that comes out of this mismatch in a lot of detail in the book. To just very briefly go over the roles and expectations. Teachers were expected to teach through simplified teacher talk in English. You've seen that they differ across the two schools, but the expectation in many ways is also the same. Teacher talk in English is what is expected. Students are expected to listen and respond in both Malayalam and English. They are explicitly told not to memorize. And the Kerala curriculum proscribed memorization, took out everything that could be used by families and students to memorize, which is why the textbook ended up being this fragment, which didn't make sense. The actual teaching methods, obviously memorization was there, but it was made meaningful through the efforts of mothers and tuition teachers. Those kinds of memorization pedagogies were not possible at the Malayalam medium school for multiple reasons. One, because English was taught as a subject, so there was lesser exposure to English at the Malayalam medium school. And also because mothers did not have, had not studied in pre-degree colleges, which mothers at the English medium school had attended. So they had some exposure to English and they could read and write English, but not speak it, as I mentioned already. And testing across both the contexts were written exams. The Kerala curriculum had standardized exams, which was across the state. There were standardized, materials that were prepared. And these were evaluated by experts and not as in not the teacher, but somebody else, so that, it's like your Viva where you need an external examiner. Now, this is the picture book from which the NCERT lesson is taken. And you can see the difference, the kind of pictorial representation that is there, which allows for meaning to be communicated, even if the language is foreign or alien, the meaning is still communicated through these sort of elaborate picture books, which the NCERT, so this is a full length picture book, which is compressed into 2 pages. And all the possibility of the meaning being communicated then gets lost. But all of this is available in high fee schools, right? So in the schools in the town, which were charging a lot more, teachers, they made sure to hire teachers who could speak English. So they typically had some migration experience, and they also had a lot of additional materials. So they had picture books and privately published textbooks. So what you see on the right-hand side, Who was Sunu Sunu, is the NCERT textbook and the kinds of questions that came after a chapter. This is like the traditional Who was Sunu Sunu, Sunu Sunu was a snail. And then that is learned by heart by writing it out 10 times. Whereas privately published textbooks had a lot more pictorial representation in early grades, and they blended. They allowed for memorization, they allowed for meaningful rote learning, but they also made sure that different kinds of pedagogies could be blended so that whatever work in whichever context could still be taken up. These are some of the materials that we did in the classroom, because I was also teaching. The last bit really is this, that those who studied in non-elite schools also during the fieldwork period were to be examined for speaking proficiency in English, because CBSE had introduced ASL, assessment of speaking and listening skills. The example, this is from the CBSE's YouTube channel, from again a high-fee school, where they don't need to learn English in school, they learn it at home. But students from the other contexts would also then be evaluated along the same parameters. So that's the book. And coming back to the questions that I began the presentation with, what were aspirations doing? What were the kinds of aspirations that were emerging? And the argument in the book is that ethical, moral womanhood was tied to histories of deprivation and experiences of social mobility. So mothers had experienced social mobility through the way their material worlds had been reconstituted, and they wanted the same experiences for their children. So aspiration became an obligation. And what aspirations did was that it disassembled a robust schooling network that was built on caste and class discriminations. As for how can families move out of intergenerational poverty, English is not just about English, and it's not just about literacy, right? I mean, as you saw with the ASL, it's also about communication skills, but again, not just about just speaking, it's also your style, your accent, the kinds of popular culture that you're familiar with, the kinds of commodification channels that you can enter into. So again, there's obviously a lot more in the book than what I described in 40 minutes. And so this is the most depressing part as to how did the education system respond to what was a possibility, what was a democratizing trend in the education system. Unfortunately, there are several ways in which it responded, and all of them are very disturbing. The aspirations were shamed, learners were deprived of whatever resources they would have had if it was even just rote learning. Even those possibilities were taken out, particularly at the Malayalam medium school with the source book and the way the standardized exams came in. And mechanisms of marginalization were reconstituted in new ways. As for dominant language, how is English a dominant language? What does English mean in the context of neoliberalism as say what it meant in the context of colonialism? It's much more complicated than it being a colonizer's language, because aspirations are fully sort of integrated into the way domination works, but also keeping in mind that it is rebuffed at every turn by experts and through reforms. Right, so that was the book, and this is the current project. You know, the questions, the broader questions are very similar. Aspirations in the context of large-scale transitions. But I'm looking at young people and professional education. And obviously the specifics and the processes then become very different. So I will stop sharing there.
Thank you, Dr. Mathew, for a really interesting and thoughtful presentation. I would now like to invite members of the audience to share any questions that they may have for Dr. Mathew. And I see that there is one comment, one question already in the chat. Um, uh, there's Sajida. Sajida, would you like to pose this question?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you so much, Leya. Very insightful. Uh, I was looking at the slides where you presented the texts. So I was just curious to understand at what age were those texts used, or age or grade, like how does that match happen? Yeah, that was the query.
So the textbooks that were there on the slides are both from second standard. But in the book, I cover a much broader. I also look at, high school, the main course book, particularly of the CBSE, because that's where the reform ideas around communicative teaching were embedded in high school textbooks. So the book looks at a broader spectrum. In the slides, what was shown was second standard textbooks.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
In case others have a question, you can unmute yourself and pose the question directly.
Hello?
Dr. Muli, we could hear you well in
Hello?
case you have a question.
Punima, am I audible from this mic?
You are audible.
Yeah, we can ask the question from you.
Hi, Leya. We all are attending the talk from a classroom. And so my question is, you had a slide where you kind of did a textbook analysis on NCRT textbook, Kerala textbook, and you took certain theoretical paradigms, and even you thought the Kerala textbook way of teaching language, there is a biological aspect to it. Can you elaborate on that slide? Why you use those categories on linguistics, biological, or even Chomsky? What is the rationale for those categories, especially textbook analysis? It would be nice if you can elaborate a little bit on your textbook analysis and also the policy analysis.
Right. So the Kerala reforms, they have a lot of material, including the Kerala curricular framework, which is, after the NCF came out, then the states had to frame their own curricular frameworks, and the KCF was framed. And the source book, parts of which are shared with you, also has a very detailed theoretical section. It's very interesting, where teachers are taught about Chomsky linguistics, and biology comes in very explicitly. So these are the terms of the reforms themselves. And a lot of this was, put together by Professor K.N. Anandan. So Professor Anandan's premise is that we are biologically equipped for language. So the universal grammar of Chomsky, that there is a section in the brain which, enables language learning. But I mean, this is, there's been a lot of criticism of this from sociolinguists who have explained that that may or may not hold true for first language learning. It cannot, or where you're talking about oracy. Literacy, there is nothing in the brain where human beings are not equipped for literacy learning the way Professor Anand expects it to be biological, which is why we also have literacy rates and people who are defined as illiterates, right? Literacy is learned very laboriously. It is taught and learned. It does not happen automatically, biologically, like how, children pick up language. So that was the Kerala framework. And it was also very oppositional. So as you saw with the source book, they were much more, in some ways, militant in the way they followed their policy expectations. And a lot of things were not allowed. And the textbooks were designed in such a way that it could not be taken up even if the students and the teacher wanted to. So the textbooks were fragmented, so there was no way they could frame the kind of questions that the NCERT textbook, would allow for. So in that sense, the more zealous the reforms, the more violent the implications became. NCERT put together largely by Professor Amritavalli. And this Amrit followed Krashen's natural acquisition to a large part. But Amrit had also done a lot more work in deprived contexts. So she was open to the idea of the textbook being taken up in very different ways. So there is a footnote in the national curriculum, there's a separate text on the teaching and learning of English. And there is a footnote that says that the learning of grammar or memorization can also allow for certain kinds of language learning to happen. It's not that, that's not a preferable method. The preferable method, the kinds that the NCERT and the Kerala SCRT are asking for, unfortunately, are very resource-rich methods, which they refuse to acknowledge. So if you have the English-speaking teacher, if you have lots of picture books, if you have all the other materials, it's wonderful, and it will be less laborious for the students. But what about those who do not have those contexts, who do not have those materials? There you are also saying that, no, you should not do whatever you can do in your context. So that is sort of how the reforms, and NCERT was very open that the textbooks are primarily designed for Kendriya Vidyalayas, which can afford certain resources. But NCERT textbooks can also become model textbooks for the whole country. And they're taken up by, and they have to be followed by states who make their own textbooks. So the implications then sort of go on into different levels, where the KV becomes, the default model school, and the entire country is not going to KV.
Is it?
This time so that she can also see.
Let me turn this. Does it work?
The best for the chair this side.
The camera is one side and the. Leah, can you see me?
Hi, Murli.
Hi. Thanks for this very detailed presentation of your book. Yeah, Leah, I mean, just continue, I would like to continue the conversation that you're having with Anu for the question that she has asked. Now, on the question of the textbook design, so NCERT, as you said, is more geared towards, communication, and then, approach towards, oral skills, and then there are a lot of resources that are also, referred to, and then they can also afford. But when it comes to the Kerala or like state textbooks, you have used some terms, categories in your presentation. They're more geared towards, form heavy kind of a structure, not and also based on the reproduction of the text or the material, the sentences in the text, rather than emphasis on picking up language orally and then spontaneously, conversing. So does it also this kind of a state's emphasis on form-rich, text-oriented reproduction of language? Does it also, in a way, reflect on the lack of proficiency among the teachers themselves, and therefore dependency on the textbook is emphasized? That's one question. So the second is with regards to your whole framework of the book itself. Now, in a way, the trajectory that you have kind of traced, as in how the mothers 40 years back, how like pre 90s, how they were, what kind of conditions they lived in, and in 2000 and later, how in what kind of condition they lived in. You've actually portrayed in terms of the kitchen and then the amenities and the houses that they have built, etc. So does it in any ways reflect the aspiration being to towards English based kind of life mobility, in the sense that those who aspire to speak English need to move out of those hut and low resourced kind of geographical spaces to a modern facilities and amenity rich localities where the schools are built. So in that sense, the very aspiration for English language itself demands mobility, social mobility, right? And that also drives the mothers and the fathers to work elsewhere rather than in the traditional occupations, so that the children get English medium education. So in that sense, is the whole old idea of Macaulay that English gives livelihood, is that something that is being followed by the marginalized groups in Kerala, and do you see a reflection of that happening elsewhere in the country?
So in terms of the Kerala SCRT textbooks, so I can go back to the slide if you want. So the source book, it's actually not focused on form. It wants spontaneous speech, but accepts that teachers cannot speak English and therefore has scripted. So yes, definitely a lot of, it expects teachers to be dependent on the textbook. That is a huge part of why the textbooks are designed in that way. As for aspiration and English demanding social mobility, so yes, they had moved into more modern spaces, right? And that experience of navigating stigma very differently, navigating precarity and stigma, and sort of possibly moving out of stigmatized locations. So that is also what drives demands for English. And in terms of traditional occupations, the traditional occupations, if you look at them, they're also caste occupations, and again, stigmatized occupations. So nobody wants to stay within the stigmatized occupations. The hope is to move into modern spaces. And in terms of how English works in this, it's not really the speaking of English at this, within this context. It would more be access to professional education through English, for instance, nursing. Any kind of professional education is available only in English, not in Malayalam, whether it is physiotherapy or nursing or engineering, any of those. So that is, those are the strategies that parents were pursuing. And those who are able to move out, particularly nurses, you could see the difference. I mean, the salaries are, tremendously different. For semi-skilled workers, as you would call them, whether it is plumbing or driving, not professional skills, but other kinds of skills. So again, they were very aware of the differences, that a professional job could give you a certain kind of respect and dignity that a driving job in the Gulf would not. So Gulf, you also know that, a lot of them have to live in labor camps. It is very hard work. You may get 10,000 more than what you get here, but the labor is very harsh and very precarious. So they're also aware of these hierarchies and where English fits them into. So, that's sort of the professional landscape that they were aware of and in tune with.
I have a question. So, in your discussion of the curriculum and the textbooks per se between the two schools, and even in response to Anumam's question, where you were discussing, for example, the underlying assumptions to building the textbooks in a particular way, I was just wondering whether you've been able to share this work of yours with the curriculum developers in the state, uh, because as you discussed, these have major implications for not just how children learn, but also the extent to which their families are able to involve themselves, as well as the teachers, of course. So I was curious whether you have had the opportunity, and to what extent they might have been receptive to the implications of your work.
So the Kerala sort of team that put together reforms, they've also moved in, it started in 93, so they've moved and sort of dispersed, come back together, dispersed again. But the people that I spoke to, so particularly O.M. Shankaran, who was the DPEP project officer for Kerala, he had a very clear understanding of the issues himself. So it's not that they were not aware of the violence that the textbooks were doing, but the way textbook writing works, and the kinds of compulsions, political compulsions that this was in the NCF happened in the context of Hinduization, anti-saffronization, and in Kerala, the left was fighting privatization. So there was always a sort of victimhood status from which the reforms were portrayed. And that this was the best that we could do when everybody was against us, when privatization is tearing down the schools. Yes, we made a lot of mistakes, but we are in such circumstances, we had to do something. So they were quite aware of particularly certain textbooks. So there's a lot of difference between first standard and second standard textbooks, for instance. Because the first and third standard textbooks were done together, there was a gap, and then the second and fourth standard textbooks were done. So through these discrepancies and the internal consistencies, they were very aware. So but how it gets defended went into the political spectrum and sort of overlooked the pedagogic implications. So which is why I think the political contexts also matter a lot in what legitimization, policy and reform is able to garner.
Comment a minute. Leya, also, can you hear me?
Leya, I have one more. Rekha, you have a question?
Yeah, what's the clarification from Leya? Is it audible?
I can't hear. It is.
Rekha, you are not audible.
Okay, let me come back later then.
She said she'll come back later. Or Rekha, you could type in your query if possible.
Will do.
Leya, I have one more question. since yours is an ethnography, and what was the kind of approach the teachers took in the class? Or did you have a chance to talk to the teachers about the textbook? Also the children and the mothers. What were the view of the mother, the child and the teacher on the textbook? And can you elaborate a little bit both on the aspiration and also the kind of learning that happened and how they viewed the textbook and English, learning of English language?
Leya, I'm sorry, a connected question to what Anu was asking is in terms of, the pedagogy, how should the teacher, were the teachers trained enough to deal or teach such materials? Were they properly trained? If you could tell us a little bit about that as well. Thank you.
Right. So I was also a teacher. So the teachers were
Oh,
my
yes, yes. Right.
So we sat in the same staff room, talked about saris and Onam and the prices of how when Onam came, the banana prices went up and all of that. And so teachers, again, at both places, they were, if you look at it from a labor perspective, these were very, very precarious jobs. The English school teaching pays less than agricultural labor, but the women still do it because they want to get out, of the surveillance of mothers-in-law, to have some form of independence, some pocket money, so they still take up the job. And several of them had children studying in the same school. So they were very invested in teaching, whether they were trained or not, they wanted the children to learn because their own children were in the same classroom. So how do they teach the textbook? Actually, before I came to an understanding of the difficulties of the textbook, it was the fact that teachers were constantly complaining about the textbook, that this is a textbook that cannot be taught, which sort of alerted me to the difficulties of the textbook. And once I started teaching it, it became, my own frustrations got added to theirs. So there were a lot of conversations around the textbooks that what do you do with this textbook? I mean, so then I had to sort of go back and sort of look at what were the assumptions that made this such an unteachable textbook in both sets of contexts. How did they teach? So they followed the usual sort of earlier methods of, in primary school for English. Actually, the other interesting part is the teaching of the alphabet, ABCD. Earlier, Malayalam alphabet was not taught in schools. It was taught by Ashan and Ashati. So in the village area, in the fieldwork area, Ashan and Ashati, their methods of teaching the literacy learning, the alphabet, so school was not where alphabet was taught. That was sort of the historical experience. But now the alphabet had to be taught in school. And then, in LKG and UKG, you have ABCD written out in 4-line notebooks. Then you have all the rhyming words, pen, men, hen. They learn to recognize words, sentences. And by the time they come to first standard, they have some vocabulary, some understanding, some words that they can pick out and read. And I used a lot of picture books. Those they were able to engage with. They could find some words that they understood, but make meaning of the story from the pictures. But they could not do that with the textbook because there was so much of text and so little illustration. So they used more traditional sort of teaching methods. There is, meaning words, which you write out 10 times and mug up. There are opposites, there is singular, plural, which is what, again, the high P schools were doing the same thing. but it was supplemented with a lot of other resources. And what was different in the non-elite English school was one that the mothers could read and write. So they kept a tab on the children when they were writing things out. So for instance, if you're writing out snail 10 times, they would make sure that at the end of it, the children could read snail and they knew what it referred to. Whereas at the Malayalam medium school, it didn't refer to anything. The meaning was lost. So there are different ways in which rote can be taken up. And a lot of the mothers' labor or the affective labor that they did, the pedagogic work that they did, was making sure that rote was meaningful. And there was a lot of resistance. Kids hate writing, everything out 10 times. And they wouldn't do it. So, which is why they were sent to tuition. Because mothers sort of distributed the resistance. So it was not that they couldn't handle, they didn't know English. That's not why they were sending their children out for tuition. It was because of the resistance. They were trying to manage student resistance. So that is how teaching learning happened at the English medium school. And what I realized that the students who came into my class, so I was asked to teach conversational English, communicative English, because then they would go on later for their ASL exams. So they needed some practice in speaking English. That's what I was asked to teach. Again, impossible tasks. I started with a lot of picture books. They could actually read the picture books and tell me the story in Malayalam or in some, bilingual kind of format. So there was language learning that had happened through the rote method, which I was able to capitalize on. And which then sort of, again, there's an entire full chapter on what are the kinds of speech that emerged in these contexts. Because English requires a certain kind of positive politeness, your please and thank you and all of that, which is not there in regional languages. We don't usually say Nanni, which is thank you in Malayalam. That's, the regional language is structured differently. It's more negative politeness. You refrain from speaking to show respect. Whereas in English, it's a very positive politeness that is expected. So how all of this sort of then marked out student speech as vernacular, even though they were speaking in English, it was a very vernacular English that they were able to produce. So again, there's a lot about teaching and learning, both literacy and speaking English as well as Malayalam. I also look at how Malayalam was taught and learned at the Malayalam medium school. So that's, sorry, was there one more question? Teacher training, right? So in private schools, a lot of teacher training happens for CBSE compliance. So for instance, when ASL came out, all the schools had to be trained about how to conduct ASL exams. So that is where teacher training happens, and that usually happens at high fee schools. It's very expensive, so for teachers from non-elite private schools to have any kind of teacher training is extremely difficult, and they do it very reluctantly. The schools send them only when CBSE requires explicit compliance. Kerala state curriculum had a lot of teacher training. Right? I mean, everybody was doing teacher training. The BRC was doing training, SSA was doing training, Diet was doing training, and they were all sort of conflicting with each other. But again, the assumption was the same, that you could only teach English if you could speak in English. That assumption held true across all of these, distributed networks, which is what was troubling. Because literacy could be learned, like I just said, at the school, there was a lot of vocabulary that was learned very laboriously, but still meanings were attached to words. There was learning that had happened. And all of that to suddenly not be recognized as teaching and learning was what had happened in teacher training sessions. I was a resource person for the teacher training because I could speak English. right? So the few people who had migration experiences, I think there were 3 or 4 of us, we were taken up by the Diet to conduct teacher training, again with the assumption that to teach, again, ethical pedagogy. Otherwise, you are giving students, you're making it burdensome for students. So ethical pedagogy was this non-accessible pedagogy, which you could, I mean, you could do it very well, but you need those resources, and you need to get those resources into the classrooms before demanding those kinds of pedagogies.
If Rekha is not asking, shall I ask another question?
First language.
Go ahead, Murli.
Okay, Rekha, thank you. Yeah, Leya, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah. What I get from your presentation, a sense of the book is something that I'm getting like this, that in the larger hope of the modern aspirations, the mothers are putting a lot of labor and investing on their children and teaching them to navigate through the textbooks and then, finally accomplish what they accomplish in order to get to the destination of modern aspirations being accomplished, right? Now that is what I am getting from your work. On the other side of this whole industry of English language and how the English is being reproduced by the market, there is also this lot of fear and anxiety associated with English. Now, I would say that most part of the country is, not population is not living in resource-rich environment where the worksheets, tuitions, and the community which helps children, imbibe language, is totally absent. So that leads to a situation of anxiety and stress related to language learning, English language learning. So, I mean, in your book, is there any element of this fear and anxiety associated with English that you're touching upon? And how do you reflect on the larger scenario out there, outside of Kerala and within Kerala, from this viewpoint of fear and anxiety associated with English? And failure in English may lead to failure in academics, right? Yeah.
Right. So fear and anxiety, it's also not just among non-elites. I think a lot of what you see in policy documents reflects the fears and anxieties of the middle classes. There's this brilliant book, I love the title, it's called Race at the Top. It's about the American context, but it holds so true for the Indian context as well, that the competition and anxiety at the top is extremely palpable. And the policy documents actually pick that up very well, but they also sort of impose it onto the entire sort of population without looking for the different ways in which fears and anxieties may be, working out, because the contexts are extremely different. So fear and anxiety, the part where I look at conversational English, I look at some of this sort of fear and anxiety amongst the middle classes and ASL and the CBSE, because the Central Board of Secondary Education, right? I mean, that's where the 11th and 12th, 9th and 10th, the board exams, the kind of anxieties that go along with it. It's not just about English, it's a whole ecosystem of fear and anxiety. And where does English fit into that? So the whole sort of MCQ and the standardizations that have happened in, and the coaching kind of pedagogy that happens in the high school grades, that is what led to the failure of the CBSE reforms for English, because they wanted a different pedagogy that was outside of this fear and anxiety. But unless it was fit into that larger anxious pedagogies of high school grades, it wouldn't work. So the main course book fails primarily because of that. So that is about, middle class classrooms and the larger sort of narrative of fear and anxiety associated with board exams, of engineering and medicine entrance exams. I mean, it's a terrible time to be in school if you think about it in terms of high schools, and the kinds of pressure that is there on children to do well. And there's also a lot of very insightful literature on that. In Kerala, David Sancho's work is exactly about that. The fear and anxiety that I describe in the book is similar and different in the sense that the emotions and the intensities are similar, but the contexts are obviously very different. So where it comes through the most is in the Malayalam medium school, where they are taught, with these fragmented textbooks, where nothing can really be taught, but then they have standardized exams that they have to face. And the kinds of fears and anxieties that very young children, second standard children, how they respond to it, and the diverse forms in which they respond is something that I described in the book. And it was also for very intense for teachers, because you feel responsible for what the students are going through and what they're facing. So there was also an extended economy of shame among teachers, particularly in Malayalam medium schools, also because training made them out as incompetent. Because all training begins with you don't know English, right? Even though they may have master's degrees and they can write excellent English, it begins with you don't know English. So there is that. Then you have students who are, it is set up in such a way that they cannot perform, because you have an oracy designed textbook and written exams. I mean, what are you supposed to do there, right? And you have these answer sheets which then go out to somebody else to correct. You are not even correcting your own students' answer papers. So the economy of shame is very extensive in Malayalam medium schools across both students and teachers. In the private school, because they follow different mechanisms, it was more about, exams are there, you're stressed about exams. If you don't get good marks, then you get beaten up. So there was that kind of fear and anxiety generalized. It was not specific to English so much, whereas at the Malayalam medium school, those around English were much more pronounced.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's this one question in chat. Sajida ma'am asked is, was the first language or the home language used during the learning process? Which was the medium of language preferred?
Yeah, Leah, you did talk about how bilingualism was used. If you could elaborate a little bit on this, because when NCF, like teaching of English, Professor Amritwal is like, she is talking about input-rich environment that Murli was talking about, and using L1. So
yes, so obviously, I mean,
yeah,
thing in most classrooms in India, even in high fee schools, the first language is used very extensively. Only the textbook is fully in English. In Kerala, the earlier grades, the textbooks were also bilingual. There's some Malayalam, there's some English. So in theory, it is very sensitive to L1. But what happens in practice and the expectations of oracy was what was problematic. But everywhere, I mean, Malayalam was definitely used everywhere. And I mean, I see
Yeah.
that here also, even in the university, all our classrooms are by
Yes, yes, it is.
it's
Because I was also thinking English medium schools switching to, or using L1 would be different uh, from Malayalam medium schools using, again, Malayalam in the class. Like, would there be a difference? See, because that aspiration again comes here, right? That because we are learning English, there should be no, home language within the class. Was there anything of that sort? That we have to now use only or speak only in English and explain or give responses only in English. So I was thinking along those lines, were there any, some points in
they would
that?
try, but it would never work. I mean, kids would speak to their friends in Malayalam. Unless you had come from the Gulf and you were comfortable speaking in English, the social life is typically conducted in the regional language, particularly outside of metros or here also. I mean, it's mixed, right? It's never just English.
Okay, I wanted to
Yeah,
check with,
thank you.
sorry, didn't mean
No, I
to
said
interrupt.
thank you. Yeah, I just said thank you.
I wanted to check with Dr. Papu if she might want to try and share her question.
Yeah, let me see. Leah, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I just wanted a clarification that whether the SCRT, Kerala SCRT publishes different kinds of English textbooks for the Malayalam medium schools and for the English medium schools, and which ones are you referring to?
That's a very interesting question. So the Kerala state sort of stand is that primary schooling has to be in Malayalam. So they
Yeah.
only have one set of textbooks, which is the ones that I shared. They got revised in 2014, so it looks very different. Kerala was told that yours is very different. The joint review mission, when they came, they told the Kerala state that your textbooks look very different from NCRT Marigold. So they were asked to revise it and make it more like the Marigold. So it
Okay.
changed quite a bit in 2014. But there were English medium sections, right? The two schools that I mentioned in
Yeah.
the panchayat, which were English medium. So it was very interesting. They used NCRT textbooks because they said we are English medium schools. Kerala state textbooks are meant for Malayalam medium. We want different. And Kerala state can't say that don't use NCRT because NCRT is the,
Yeah. Okay.
the
Yeah.
academic, the model for the country. So you can't deny that as well. So
Okay.
all of these strategies that schools were using to distinguish themselves from Malayalam medium.
I was wondering if the textbook writers would have adopted a different approach, but obviously not, because they had just one set of textbooks as you're explaining, right? Because I was thinking too, and your talk today clarified that the aspiration shaming of parents or the Malayalam medium should actually be less because they're aspiring for education and not necessarily English medium education. But like you say, the economy of shaming exists because there's no ethical pedagogy, and that part is forced much more for English than probably for other pedagogies of other subjects. Yeah, I get that a little more now.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Wanted to check if anybody has any last questions.
Yeah, just another thought, Leya, since you can hear me now and everybody, that there's always this there's a sense that an earlier generation, and I'm speaking of like those with cultural capital who did go through regional medium education, they had no problems adapting to English when they got to it at a in the higher educational institutions. I'm wondering what that difference was, apart from cultural capital. Was it also, I'm trying to push your argument, though that's not where you're going, that English teaching English pedagogy was not so oriented, but the literacy practices probably also helped the earlier generations learning of English without this mess that it is, that the teaching is communicative, but the exams are written, and that literacy divide is so much more pronounced now. So I was wondering if that could be a reason. So that's something that I deciphered for myself. I don't know what you would want to say about that.
I think so too, because, like for my generation, when I was in school, none of us could speak English, but we could all write compositions, write essays on Shakespeare and whatever, but not one sentence in English. And when I went to college in Madras and I saw all the metro, like the others speaking English, that's where then I started learning to, speak English. But that didn't mean that I didn't know English earlier. So I think this insistence on oracy is one very recent, and there were other ways of knowing English. So Indian English, what Kachru is writing about, is also written English. Kachru is not writing about spoken English. So I think a lot of the earlier definition of English itself and expectation was of literacy, very advanced and sophisticated literacy skills.
It's also a globalized world, like you see, and therefore the English is positioned very differently again, in which these kinds of aspirations get lost. Yeah.
Because a lot of my students, they come from Gujarati medium, they can write fairly well, but they find it difficult to, come up and give a presentation or to speak. So there are other, proficiencies that we can build on.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, I would then like to extend our gratitude and thanks to Dr. Mathew for taking the time out and speaking to us about your book. Dr. Matthews, your talk today has really reminded us that the promise of English education is very complex, it's multi-layered, and to understand and to sort of do justice to understanding the issue, we must situate that understanding in both a social and historical context. And also keep in mind, like you spoke about, how non-elite mother or mothers who had children studying in the non-elite Malayalam medium school, while they share obsessive hopes for their children's futures, these also exist alongside the vast economies of shame that you discussed, in multiple ways for teachers, for students, and for parents themselves, which paints a picture of uh, both violence and fear and anxiety around the teaching and learning of English. So thank you very much for sharing your work and your research and thoughts with us, and also to the audience members who asked such engaging and interesting questions and could help us extend this discussion further. Last but not the least, I'd like to thank the faculty of the TISS Azim Pinky School of Education and our program coordinator for helping to organize this talk, which is always a very useful way for us to connect what we're learning with larger discussions in the field of education. So with that, thank you everyone for participating and attending, and I wish you all a good evening from all of us here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Nima, thanks, Leya. Yeah.